Our celebration of podcasts continues. It's International Podcast Day 2017. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. I'm your host for the next few hours of our coverage. International Podcast Day would not be possible without our fantastic sponsors. So thanks to Blueberry, a full-service podcast company. They provide stats, hosting, even a WordPress website for you at different levels. You can get your podcast up and running, submitted to Apple Podcasts in as little as 15 minutes. Check them out at blueberry.com. That's Blueberry without the E's, blueberry.com. Also, International Podcast Day is supported by Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, opening today, International Podcast Day, September 30th. They're a full-service cafe, and they have 2 working podcasting studios. That's really cool. Check them out at studio21podcast.cafe. International Podcast Day is also brought to you by The Messengers, a podcast documentary that really shows the amazing power of podcasts. Perfect fit for International Podcast Day. Hey, if you are able to step away from the stream, or you're forced to step away from the stream, the only other approved thing to watch today is The Messengers. Go to themessengersdoc.com to learn more and order your own copy from iTunes or Amazon. Also brought to you by Potable. This is a search engine to help you discover podcasts related specifically to your tastes. Go to play.potable.co. That's play.podibele.co. And finally, thank you to our bronze sponsors, the Audacity to Podcast, Modern Life Podcast Network, and Podbean. We really couldn't do this without our sponsors. It may seem kind of strange to have sponsors sponsor a holiday, but it makes things like this live stream, like the development, like the website hosting, and a lot of other stuff that does cost somebody money. And we really appreciate our sponsors and partners celebrating with us and supporting this special day. Our next speaker is Ray Milidoni. I hope I pronounced that right. He's from Australia, and he's the host of the Razor Sharp Show podcast. And he helps other people launch their podcasts over at podcastlaunch.co. That's podcastlaunch.co. He'll be sharing with us the 6 P's of podcasting, and podcasting certainly has many P's. I'm going to guess one of them is probably passion, because that's such a buzzword in podcasting. But Ray, thank you very much for joining us from Australia and being part of International Podcast Day. I'll hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's super excited to be here today. I remember being a guest last year, and this year I'm absolutely honored to be a speaker and to share, what the journey has been for myself and my co-host, who is on his honeymoon at the moment, so he's not able to join me tonight, but I was fortunate enough to actually be his best man. So our next book's going to be How Podcasting Got Me to Best Man. So that's the power of podcasting, and podcasting has truly changed our lives, and it's opened up so many doors and windows and everything that possibly is able to open, and we're definitely excited about what podcasting has done. I'm just going to share some screens so you can get some visual representations of myself and Matt and our podcast. That is at the Razor Sharp Show. It started nearly 18 months ago, and it's been so much fun to do it. Basically it is a passion project, and it always started off as that, and people always ask us, how do you make money? And it's like, well, you don't make money out of all your passions and things like that. So, but I know a lot of people can monetize their podcast, and it's a great thing to do when you kind of get there. And thanks to Penguin ZA, I'll let Matt know that you congratulated him. It was absolutely great to, share that day with him, and I know it happened all because of the podcast, and there'll be an email somewhere in these slides later when Matt first asked to connect to be the co-host as well. But we got really passionate about 6 months in after launching the podcast, and that's the reason why we started the podcast launch.co, because we wanted to create a platform where people could kind of hang out and ask questions and really get behind what it's like to start a podcast, because it may sometimes seem like something that's quite easy, but then often it can get really complicated. Everyone always tends to geek out on the tech, and I know people who have purchased thousands of dollars of equipment, and yet they don't even know how their show flow is going to go, or what the show name's going to be, or what the artwork needs to be to be like, or how they even submit it to the Google, to iTunes and syndicate it through all the podcatchers and so forth. So that's why Matt and I went, well, there's a lot of people asking us questions, and it might be time that we start sharing what we know. So over at Podcast Launch Co, there is heaps of articles, and it's a growing database of information. And we've actually covered in depth the 6 Ps of podcasting on our podcast, and they're also embedded on the website. But today I'll go through it as well, so there's no need to head over there just yet. The Razor Sharp Show is in its 90+ show, and Matt and I are truly excited about the legacy and the impact that our podcast has been able to do. To give you a little briefing on what the podcast is about, it's from the 7th habit of 7 habits of highly effective people, which the 7th habit, if you haven't read the book, is sharpen the saw. And it's about constantly being around people who are always wanting to educate themselves and to learn something new and to keep your saw sharp, So it's about sharpening your tools, because that's the best way to get the job done. There's no point cutting a tree down with a blunt saw. The minute you sharpen it, your efficiency rate goes up. So we started the Razor Sharp Show as a bit of a play on that. And because my nickname was Razor Ray, around workplaces and things like that. So when the name kind of fell together, it was just one of those aha moments where I went, yep, that's what we're going to be calling the show. It kind of named itself. Some of the questions we get when it comes to podcasting is podcasting hard? Does it take lots of time? And when will I make money from it? Everyone wants to monetize their podcast because they see financial reports from some big podcasters and think that this is how they're going to bank some money. But these are some of the myths that we try and help people through our workshops and mastermind programs and one-on-one coaching that we do. And Matt and I go around Melbourne. We're from Melbourne, Australia. We've actually started a local Melbourne meetup group with a few podcasters here in Melbourne. We've just recently launched that. I may actually put the link of that in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, feel free to share that. But we did start a Melbourne podcast meetup group, so for those who are on the live today from Australia or Melbourne, it would be great to see you down there, because we really felt that podcasting is one of those things that is done in isolation and people are kind of doing it alone. And we wanted to kind of create a community of people here in Melbourne. And our first event had 95 RSVPs. It was pouring rain and 45 people still made it into the room. And it was a really big success, because our goal was to have 20 people. And, that's just one of those other things that has happened from having a podcast and connecting with the right people and going to award nights and chatting all things podcasting, and one idea leads to another. And so we cover that's basically another way where we get to hang out and talk podcasting and speak to different speakers and so forth. So the questions that we get all the time is podcasting hard? No. Does it take a lot of time? No, not if you're organized. And will you make money? Maybe, but not at the start. It's one of those things where you have to have the long game at heart. The good news is that there is a lot of support when it comes to podcasting. So while there are a lot of moving parts, there are definitely things that require a little bit of technical knowledge. But these days, people are a little bit more forgiving when it comes to, the perfect cutness of your audio, sound effects and things like that. When you're first starting off, it can, be a little bit daunting, especially the microphones and the technology and mixers and all that. People tend to overcomplicate it. The speaker that was just on before me said you could record a podcast on your iPhone. And I know that I've had opportunities to interview someone and I've literally plugged a lapel microphone into the iPhone and recorded an interview with the world's smallest interview mic. So it is definitely possible. And you can make a podcast from anywhere. It's just about that consistency and so forth. But the good news is there's lots of support out there to help you do it. There's lots of blogs and articles. Podcast Launch Co is just one site that we've put together where we've basically created lots of videos on how to do things for our members and our community, and we've just kind of open sourced it to that page there. It does take a lot of time initially. I know that time is one of those questions that people are starting a podcast. They're normally doing it, while they've still got full-time jobs. You'd be pleased to know that Matt and I have successfully run the Razor Sharp Show for over a year and a half now. At the start, we were dropping 2 episodes a week. We then went to 1 episode a week after our launch series, and we basically initially spent probably about 6 to 10 hours a week. So we got home from work and we recorded interviews, and some of our interviews were international guests. So, we were getting up at 4 a.m. in the morning before work and recording the interview, then edit them at night. And the good news is that you get into a good rhythm and a good flow. And eventually you start realizing that there's some shortcuts you can take, or some copying and pasting that can happen. And you can kind of, bring that down to a nice number. We pretty much spend about 3 hours maximum a week on our podcast. And these days, we've actually delegated the editing to an editor. So we're probably spending about an hour to an hour and a half a week on the podcast. And our editor and publisher is doing that. But we didn't get that until about 13 months, 14 months into the cycle. Will you make money from podcasting? It is definitely one of those questions that we kind of feel that podcasts that have really good traction initially are not the ones that are going to be loaded with lead magnets and call to actions and treated like traditional websites or funnels and things like that. I definitely believe that podcasting is something that is there to create authority and to build on your current authenticity and your current product or service. And we kind of say it's there to amplify what you're already doing. And sometimes that can be by being able to connect with influencers in your industry and inviting them onto the podcast. It's a great low-hanging fruit to get the attention of some of the key people of influence in your network. So I'm going to share back to my screen because I thought it would be better if I was on screen. But this is the what we call the famous email. This is the email that Matt sent me in February 2016, where he basically was seeing how I'm doing. And I was making some video blogs at that time. And he asked whether if I'd be looking for a co-host. And up until this point, I never really considered a co-host for the Razor Sharp Show. But I definitely have to say, without this email, I don't think the podcast would have existed. Accountability and having someone ride the wave with you is definitely something that is going to help you express your podcast, because having a team working together, being able to bounce ideas off each other, and even just committing and going, yep, we're going to get this done by Tuesday, was a huge benefit for the Razor Sharp Show. So if you are in a position where maybe you can buddy up with another podcaster and launch a podcast at the same time and move that forward, it definitely is something that can help you. And I'm very thankful for Matt for reaching out to me and asking to be a co-host, because after that, shit got real and we just really started getting stuff done. And we really moved fast, and it was good. We set a launch date and we missed it by a week, but that was still pretty good. And we launched our podcast with an actual launch party. So we dropped our 6 episodes, and then we actually had a physical party about 2 weeks later where we invited people and guests that had been on the show that supported the podcast. And we had a physical party down at a co-working space. And that just kind of really made it real and made it feel like we were launching a business, not just a podcast. And that was definitely something that was one of our guests' idea, actually. We were having an interview, and Megan Davis was like, maybe you should have like a launch party because this thing's going to blow up. And we're like, that is a fantastic idea. Would you like to be a guest and share your experience of how the podcast went? And she's like, yes. And she actually helped us find the space. And so that's a kind of amazing stuff that can happen with just your podcast guests during an interview. And pre and post interviews, there can be some very powerful conversations that happen. So that, definitely don't just see your podcast guests as someone who's going to be talking on and answering your questions and so forth. See how you can kind of work together or joint venture and so forth. So let's jump into what you're all here to see and what you're all been waiting for, the 6 Ps of podcasting. Now, this is just basically a framework that Matt and I have been putting together over the last 18 months, or well, probably about 12 months, because we only launched the Podcast Launch Co. about 6 months ago. And we basically put this together, and we basically built it on like what would be the document that we wish we had when we launched our podcast. And we had a Trello board where we had all the information that we did for our podcast, and we just reverse engineered that and went, right, well, this is the six, this is a bit of a framework. Look at these columns and these lists, and they've kind of accidentally created what we now call the 6 Ps of podcasting. And we run full day workshops, and we have a workbook that steps out like a fill in the blank template to get your podcast underway. So I'll share links to that workbook at the end, because it's normally valued at $49 on our website. But as a special guest of today, an International Podcasting Day, we've decided to give it to all participants for free. But the link will be at the end, where you can basically get that. It's a Google Doc. You just basically start filling out the blanks. So the first P, and unfortunately none of the Ps are passion, but definitely passion falls within the first one. And the first P is purpose. Purpose is basically where you're going to find out your why you're doing the podcast. It's basically where you understand who your audience is going to be and why you're creating the podcast. And if it's to make money, that's fine, but you just need to realize that there's a different strategy. Yeah, good job on not conforming to the buzzword. No worries. It's definitely a passion project. We definitely refer to that a lot when we're doing our workshops, because we feel that if you're not fueled by passion, you're not going to see it through. I'm always amazed when people tell me that most podcasts fade, which is known as pod fading, at 7 or 8. And once you get to like 20, people see you as someone who's committed, which just blows my mind. So all those podcasters who get to the 100+ episode, which is where we're getting to very soon, we're very proud to hit that milestone. A good book and a resource that we always recommend at this point here is Simon Sinek Starts With Why. I think it's really important to kind of know your why and whether your podcast aligns to who you are, and you're not creating the podcast just because it's a fun thing to be doing and it's so hot right now and everyone's starting podcasting. It's really important to know why you're doing it. And I tell you, I wake up every morning with a new podcast idea, and I've got to refrain myself. It used to be business ideas, and now it's podcast ideas. I think it's also really important that you do align it with who you are and why you are as a being, because it's great to be talking from the heart when you're talking on a podcast, as opposed to talking from your head, because people these days can really sense authenticity, and people's BS radar are really in tune these days. So if you're talking from a script, or you're just kind of creating, repurposing someone else's content, someone's going to pick up on that. It's going to come through the energy, it's going to come through your voice. And when people have got your voice in their earbuds so close to their brain, it's very interesting how powerful sound waves can be, and how people can pick up from that. So really pick a topic that's going to be close to your heart and not your head, and really think about how much time commitment you've got, and can this work within your current business or your current lifestyle, and is it a hobby thing that you're going to take to the next level? The next P is plan. So many times I see people who, they're just not planning for their podcast, either interview or their actual launch, or what their podcast actually looks like. It's really important to kind of know the format of I'm just going to share the slides here because there is some resources here. It's really important to kind of know your format, how your framework's going to go, what the show flow is like, and be very organized with your calendar and your publishing schedule, because consistency is key when it comes to podcasting. Like, people wake up on a Tuesday morning waiting for the Razor Sharp show. If we don't deliver the Razor Sharp show on a Tuesday morning, we have some upset Razor community out there. So it's really important to get that consistency going. And it doesn't have to be weekly. It doesn't have to be daily. It could be one episode a month, but it might get released on the first Tuesday of every month or on the second of every month. Like, it's really important to pick a schedule and stick to it. I'm just reading some questions. Sometimes that's when I take pauses just to see whether I need to keep it relevant or if I can answer them at the end. So I've got a link here, which is razorsharpshow.com/show flow. That's an example of what our show flow looks like. So that way I know that every time I button on and I'm about to do an interview, this is the flow that I'm going to be following. Cool. So that was a resource there. The next P is platform. So once you kind of know why you're doing the podcast and what it's going to look like, then you need to understand the platform. Now, obviously, podcasting has certain things that go with it, like artwork, description. You got to find a host. And at this point, we're not even kind of thinking about the host so much. It's more about what it's going to look like, where it's going to kind of live, and whether you're going to have your own dedicated website, all those moving parts. I think by far the number one important thing is your artwork, because that becomes your brand. The branding of your podcast is really important because that's kind of what people know it as. It amazes me how many people's artwork have really small writing, and once you put it onto a phone, you just can't see it anymore. Now, we're guilty of this. Our artwork initially was horrible. It broke all the rules. It had 2 microphones on it. It had podcasts like 3 times. It had a web URL on it. It didn't render really well on a small handheld device. It just broke every cliche and rule of artwork. So, really think about your artwork, what it looks like. To give you a little bit of a sneak peek, we are actually working on a bit of a tool at the moment that is going to help you check what your artwork looks like on podcasts, and we'll launch that very shortly. It's in beta mode at the moment. It's at podcastlaunch.co/art checker, I think it is. Let me just confirm that. Artwork check. It's in beta mode, but basically you load your artwork up there and it creates thumbnails of what your artwork will look like. This is very off the cuff. I didn't think I was going to bring this up, but this is very beta. It's not even finished, but hey, would love anyone's feedback on it, because we think that it's a tool that will really help people know what their artwork is going to look like once they've launched their podcast. Then we'll go into the 4th P, which is produce. So this is when you can actually start getting your hands dirty. People want to start recording their first episode before they even know what their show is going to be called. We find that it's really important to follow a certain framework, because at the end of the day, that's how good things get made, is following a process, keeping to it, and really understanding that there's a process that you need to follow. I remember once we got asked to do a presentation, and we normally present our framework in a 2-hour workshop, and we go in depth, and everyone has the workbook and they get to fill it out about their podcast. And they said, "Oh, can you do a short version of it and just do like the last P's, which is all about, the publishing and getting the podcast actually out?" And we're like, "No, because unless you know your why, you're not going to publish really well. And you're not going to build your audience, and you're not going to know how to promote it." So it's really important that you follow the process and go through it step by step. So number 4 is produce. Produce is actually now all about the equipment, the setup, actually recording the interviews and things like that. At this point here, we always tend to give some kind of like interviewing tips and so forth. My number 1 tip is always have water, because people don't realize how parched your mouth can be when you're talking on a microphone. It just, something changes, and it's not like having a conversation, and sometimes, having a pen and paper nearby, having a pen and paper nearby is really important, because the guest will say something and it's best to just write a little note, because if you keep thinking about it, you're actually not listening to the guest. You're not being present at the moment. One of the other things that I do is I actually turn the video on. So if I'm using Skype, which is the number 1 kind of tool that I use to record my interviews, I want to have the video on because it feels like a more authentic conversation, as opposed to turning the video off and just having audio. And the guest could be looking out the window, not really concentrating on you, or you could be kind of on your phone chatting to friends and not really listening to the guests. I always know when I'm listening to a podcast and the host will come back and go, yeah, that's great, and now my next question is this, and I'm just thinking, God, that was a wasted opportunity. You could have gone deeper in that point. It was such a good point, and clearly the host was distracted and just kind of didn't hear what the person was saying because they were worried about checking the next question and so forth. And for me, I used to be very script based. I used to follow the flow to the T, but now I just go wherever the conversation goes, wherever it leads me, that's where I'm taking the conversation, because I feel like that's what was meant to have been said, and that's what was meant to have been done. It's okay to break the rules of your own podcast. No one's going to know or hold you accountable for it. So, here's about the equipment. I started the podcast and Matt also on very low budget equipment. My first microphone was like $30 off eBay. I had no pop filters. It was all very green, and I was just kind of making a mess as I was building the runway, and the plane was taking off. But, it was good to kind of learn that way. So don't worry too much about the equipment. You can record it off your phone. Phones have amazing equipment these days from their cameras and capturing capabilities. It is important to research your guest a little bit, understand who they are. But I'm also really big of, I don't want to talk about what's already online. Like if I can Google a fact or a figure about my guest, then that's not really something I want to talk about. Yeah, I might want to announce that they've got a book coming up and they're a bestseller and they're an international speaker. But I want to have a conversation that starts exploring things that they haven't really shared much. And I really know that when I get to the end of the podcast and people are like, wow, I've never shared those stories before. And I'm like, yes, I've won. That's the kind of content that I want to be producing, where people are sharing stories from their childhood. One of the questions I ask is, how did you make your first dollar? People are like, business, or when I was, 5 years old and set up a lemonade stand. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about the lemonade stand. And, do you think that's where you became, entrepreneurial and things like that? And so I find it really interesting when people, share those stories, and I've had guests kind of choke up and tear because they're sharing stories that they've never shared to the world, and obviously with their permission, they grant me permission to be the content that announces that, and I love the fact that I'm creating unique content and not just stuff that I can Google about my guests left, right, and center. So I want it to be a show that's different and unique. And that comes by researching, so what's already on the internet for them. So I don't research my shows to what to talk about. I research the shows of what not to talk about in a weird way. First impressions are really important. So the minute your microphone is on, you are on. It's high energy, high game. It's all that's where you need to be at your peak. A lot of people try and warm up into the interview. If you need to warm up into interviewing, then start your interview with a 15-minute pre-interview chat with your guests. So that kind of warms you up, and that warms them up as well. And it's really important that you manage your guests during the interview. It's your show, and it's up to you to kind of make sure that they rock up on time, that they are talking about what's going to be interesting to your community and to your listeners. Good morning from USA. I think it's like 4 a.m. there. It's 9:30 p.m. here in Australia. And tomorrow's daylight saving, so everyone's going to get really confused in Australia about all the times and the schedules, but that's all good. That's their problem tomorrow. So that's kind of in a nutshell about producing. I've shared my interviewing kind of tips. Have the video on, have water, have pen and paper, and research your guest of like what not to do. Manage your guests as well. Like when I'm about to go live on the podcast, I say to them like, I'm going to refer to my community as the Razor community. So feel free to talk to them as the Razor community. So I'll stop every now and then and go, Razor community, really hear what guest has said about X, Y, and Z. And that's to give the guest a bit of time to kind of think and relax, take a drink of water. But I really want it to be like a conversation to my community. And I want the guests to feel that as well. Our shows can be marked as explicit. So I always let the guests know that if you happen to swear because you're really passionate about something, then it's okay to just let it go. Like, the worst thing that happens is someone swears and then they're like, oh, is it okay to swear? Great, now I have to edit that out. So it's less work like that. And one thing that I've really found out that works really well is I do a backwards counter. Now, this was actually Matt's tip and he shared it with me, but it just puts everyone into like a bit of a state of zen. And I go, right, we're going to have like a 5-second silence, obviously to get background noise. For you who edit, it's really good to get a sample of the background noise and the hums if you're going to do a noise reduction. There's a video about that on the podcastlaunch.co website. And then I go 3, 2, 1. Hi, guest, and welcome to the Razor Sharp Show. And that 3, 2, 1 really lets the guests know that it's about to start. And it kind of comes from the old movie days where they used to have that little timer and go beep, beep, and then it will be silent, and then it would start. It's a nice way to kind of ease into the interview as opposed to just like shouting their name and saying, hi, guest, and it all comes with a little bit of a shock. So I noticed a big difference of how the guests responded to me saying hello and welcome to the show ever since I put that countdown timer in. All right. You can tell I really love interviewing and podcasting from that one there. The 5th P is publish. So this is the time now where you've got your podcast recorded and it's time to publish the podcast. I guess some of my tips here is about, you got to make sure that it's, picking your schedule and making sure that your show goes live at the right time every day or every week based on your schedule. This is when you start thinking about what your show's title is going to be. I always find it a little bit frustrating when people put like episode 1, 2, 3 in the title. Like, that is a waste of a lot of characters. I've seen a lot of podcasters now even dropping the podcast number because, the title of your episode is really important. It's kind of like, how you rank on Google. That's the title of the podcast. So, making sure that it's something enticing, that it's relevant to what the show is about. You don't want, to be how you're going to crush Facebook and then you're talking about all social media. And it's like, oh, well, you hooked me in on Facebook and now you've spoken about all social media. Well, that was a little bit of a bit of a con. So, make it really relevant. I always put the guest's name in the title because I feel that from a ranking point of view, when people search for particular people of interest, I kind of want the podcast to come up for that. This is a time where you start thinking about your description of the show. Show notes is really important. We used to long form our show notes. Over the months and years, we've kind of shortened our show notes, only maybe because I feel like as a listener to a podcast, I'm very rarely looking at people's show notes and clicking links and things like that. But we still put people links there. We still write show notes, but we've tend to brief them up a little bit. But I know that there's power in long form show notes, especially from an SEO point of view, if you have a website to support your podcast. So that's really important as well. We also do episode artwork. So we push through the iTunes feed an artwork of the actual guest's profile. So we just kind of felt that people would be more likely if they were looking for Michael Gerber, who has been a guest on the show, bit of a name drop there. But if his face comes along with the interview, they're more likely to click that than if it was just the generic artwork of the show. So we do create artwork for the guest for that. For each show, it's a little bit of extra work, but we use Canva for all our editing, and it literally takes us about 5 minutes now. Like I said before, as you do your podcast more, you start realizing what you can copy and paste, and it's really, really good about how you can kind of shortcut and make certain processes for you to make that happen really easy. And then one of the things that we haven't done yet, but we know that there's a bit of a need for it, is transcriptions. And, this is for people who, and my biggest thing, if we go back and transcribe all the show, it's for like hearing impaired because, you know, a lot of hearing impaired people want to jump onto podcasts, but they just can't because there is no transcriptions of what's being said. One of the tips that we've kind of done is we create a video of our podcast, and then we upload that to YouTube, and YouTube will 80% nail the transcribing of it. We haven't been religious about this, but it's definitely something. We've actually had a couple of people reach out saying, is there transcriptions of your show coming? And we haven't actioned it just yet, but it's definitely something to think about. And I definitely see the need for it. You know, we've seen it happen on TV. We've seen it happen on YouTube where, you know, people want the transcriptions, even online courses and things like that. If people are hearing impaired or even visually impaired, they can't see the video or hear the audio well, you know, depending on either one, then they want to be able to read it and things like that. And that's why podcatchers have, you know, the ability to slow speed down and things like that. So that's great that that's all built in. And then before you publish and before you do everything, it's also important to back everything up. How many times I've heard people say that they've lost interviews or things like that. You know, it's really important to kind of back your podcasts up. And then once you've basically published the podcast, now I'm also going to talk a little bit about the tech that we use, only because we like to support Australian-based businesses. I know that Blueberry is a sponsor of International Podcast Day, but I do want to give a shout out to Omni Studio because they have been a huge asset in launching our podcast and have really helped us, you know, get the podcast where it is today because of their technology and the easeability to kind of basically use them as a host. So we upload all our podcasts to Omni Studio, and that it works really, really well for us. One of the things that they do really well is they have like a bit of an out-of-the-box website that you can use for your podcast. And so if anyone's looking to launch their podcast and they don't want the hassle of launching with a website at the moment, definitely a great way to kind of just plug and play and have a nice out-of-the-box solution. And then once we've basically published, then it's really important. Amanda says, I love Omni too. Yeah, it's really, really great. I think it's got some really great features. And I love the fact that they're a Melbourne company. And so they're very close to my heart because I'm kind of supporting local, which means a lot to me as well. The 6P, which is our final P, and then we'll see if there's any questions and I'll read through the chat as well, is promote. It's really important that you promote your podcast. So many people create a great podcast and, you know, they're just trying to sell a secret. They don't let the world know that there is this gift that is available on the internet. And I often say that podcasting is like creating these little bundles of gifts that you're gifting to the world because, you know, you're capturing this conversation that has value in it and has, you know, aha moments and has information that can kind of change people's lives. And then you do nothing to share it to the world. So, you know, there are ways that you can automate some of your podcast promoting, but doing simple things like just tagging the guest into your post or letting your guests know that the interview has gone live. I've been on so many excuse me, I've been on so many podcasts where I have to like check their website and go, oh, I got published like 3 weeks ago. You know, like it's so important to let your guests know that their artwork, that their podcast is live. We even create artwork for them to use to share it. We give them the embed code so they can embed the player onto their website. That's another little feature of Omni Studio. So it's all these little things that make it really easy. Now, I basically fill out like a MailChimp form with the guest's name and their email address and their Twitter link and their code, and then I just push submit. And it automatically sends them a nice email saying, hey, you've been published. This is your artwork link. This is your Twitter link. This is your embed code. And then 2 weeks later, it sends them a reminder and saying, hey, just, you know, it's been 2 weeks. Can you believe it? You've been published for 2 weeks. And that all happens on autopilot. Don't tell anyone that little secret. I don't want my guests to know. So, you know, they're little things that you can do. Now, at the start, we were writing emails. You know, we're doing it all manually. And then we went, hang on, can we automate this? It still has the same personal touch. It's still as if we were doing it, but we've found tools that can help us along the way. Keep your promoting consistent. We, like I said before, we always put the guest's headshot on the artwork because, you know, people that are looking for the guest, they're going to be more likely to resonate with that. You know, the show should be about the guests, not about you. I get frustrated sometimes when I listen to podcasts and the host speaks for like 60% of time and the guest speaks for 40, because I think it should be like 20% the guest, the host, and 80% the guest, because, you know, the show's meant to be about them, not about, you know, the stories that the host wants to retell and reshare. If you want to talk about yourself, do a solo show, and it's okay to do that. With the Razor Sharp Show, we actually have the Razor Sharp Show, which is my segment that I do interviewing guests. Then Matt does a deep dive with the guests, so that's how he interviews the guests a second time, and they go into a deep dive discussion. And then we then do a raw episode where it's Matt and I who talk between ourselves, and that's our conversation type of segments. And the raw episodes have done really well, to the point where we've sometimes thought maybe we need to pivot the podcast into just a, you know, Matt and I type of show. And it's really important to just get all your friends and family onto it. I love the idea of the previous guests who said that they have like a WhatsApp channel where they announce the podcast and everyone gets pinged about the podcast. We have a MailChimp account that alerts people about the podcast. We do like a monthly digest, and we say, how to stay sharp this month. And we basically list the last 4 weeks of episodes with a little bit of a description there. So every month, our Razor community are getting updates on what shows that have been released. So we just keep trying to drive them back to the podcast and to listen. Consistency. And another way to promote your podcast is to be a guest on other people's podcasts. Surprise, you've already got all the technology. So podcasters are going to love the fact that you rock up with some pro equipment, and it's a great way to scale your podcast. So I've gone on a little bit of a road show, I guess, and been on a handful of different podcasts, and it is a great way of growing your audience and letting other people know that your podcast exists. And even if you get 1 or 2 listeners from each podcast that you do, or from a live event that you do, or you be a guest speaker talking about your podcast journey at a local meetup, every bit of effort that you do and you pick up 1 or 2 or 3 listeners, that's kind of just putting them in, and it's compounding through that. Also, when you do your sharing, make it evergreen. Don't put dates and times and this week and all that, because then it's not easy to be evergreen. Create all your promoting material to be evergreen, so that way it can keep getting shared by your guests or by you. I've got a guest who's put their show on Meet Edgar. So every couple of weeks, or I think it's every 6 weeks, he shares the same artwork again. And when he wrote the post, he wrote something that was linked to one of his launches, and every time it comes up, it says we're our June launch, and I'm like, it's not June anymore, and this was like June last year. So I've pinged him, and it's never been updated, but keep it evergreen. West for East says, love the word evergreen. I know it's a bit overused, and people think that they can do evergreen courses and things like that. With the Razor community, we want to make sure that it's always personal and relevant, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're creating useful content that happens all the time. The other thing that's really helped us was when we did the podcast launch party. We got heaps of testimonials, and we got people who were part of the Razor community to record videos. We actually set up like a little podcast. I had my setup there, and people would walk up to the camera and just record us a message, and that's on YouTube somewhere, and it's just fun. It's really fun material. It has really good energy, and it works really well. I'm just going to jump back to my screen because I'm just going to talk about our toolbox a little bit. So obviously, in a nutshell, if you haven't launched a podcast and you're looking to get started, and that's obviously what angle we're taking, and I know a lot of people here are probably already podcasters, and this is old news, but iTunes Podcast Connect is going to be the first thing you kind of need um, and that's where you submit your podcast to the iTunes directory. We use Skype and Call Recorder. I was going to merge them together and call it Score Recorder. But that's an easy way to kind of get recording off Skype. Yes, you can get fancy mixers and so forth and pipe, your phone audio into a mixer and record it all into a Zoom and get really fancy. And that's a great goal to have. But initially, it's okay to just start recording via Skype and Call Recorder. Call Recorder is about $30 and you get all the updates, and it's the price for life. So it's a very low entry. Omni Studio, again, has been a great help with us. It's just given us all the tools to get started. They do have prices for different entry levels. If it's outside your level of pricing, send me an email, because we have some deals for our mastermind members that we can share a little bit outside of that as well. Then Audacity is what we use to edit with. I know a lot of people use GarageBand. There's quite a few different audio editing, but Audacity is free. Again, on the website, we've got a lot of videos of how to do noise reduction, how to amplify your audio, how to do some cuts and things like that. And then we do have a whole list of tools that we use. A whole tools that we use at our toolbox. So if you go to Podcast Launch Co. /toolbox, then there is a bit of an unlock thing there that you need to do, and it releases all our tools that we use, and it can be a great starting point for people who want to explore how to do it. And we break everything up to our 6 Ps. Our whole website is mapped out to the 6 Ps of podcasting as well. So I said that I was going to give you the workbook, and here it is. This is a little gift from the Razor community and from Podcast Launch Co. So if you head over to podcastlaunch.co/workbook, there is no opt-in here. We don't want email addresses. This is purely a gift. It's normally valued at $49. That's AU. So it's we're in Australia, so it's all AU prices. But if you go to the /workbook, it will redirect you to a Google Doc. And that is available for all International Podcast Day listeners, either live or on the replay. So head over to that, download the workbook. It's. I think I've got a physical one on my desk, but it is a. It's a physical workbook that you can print out. It's got fill in the blanks and all that. This is kind of like the document that we wish we had when we were starting our podcast, and that was the reason why we developed it and wanted to share it. So that was the least I could do for everyone who wanted to rock up. I know here in Melbourne it's 9 p.m. and now it's 10 p.m. and in America it's very early as well. I'm just going to read through some of the comments, and someone's thanked for thinking about the newbies. No problems. That is, why we started what we wanted to do. What else have we got? I know the word evergreen has been overused, and so is authentic. I know, but unfortunately it just works. But for me, it's all about the energy. I think energy can definitely be felt over the airways. And hopefully you've felt it tonight. For me, it's really important that the minute the mic's on, it's a game. There's no warming up. It's like when the buzzer starts for a basketball game, you don't warm up then, you warm up before the buzzer starts. And I think podcasting is the same. There's lots of good mornings. For me, it's good night. Yeah, it looks like everyone's enjoyed the session. We really thrive on people who launch their podcast. So if this session today and some of the content inspires you to start your podcast, all we ask is just to let us know, because Matt and I are on a mission to help launch 100 podcasts. We're currently sitting on about 14 to 15 successful podcasts, which we think is over 10 episodes. So you've got to launch a podcast and get to the 10th episode before we think that you've kind of made it in this industry. So without further ado, thank you very much for tuning in. And I know that we have some sponsors. If there's any questions, I'm happy to hang around for a little bit. I can see that Dan's piped back in. He's giving me some smiles and nods.
Ray, this has been fantastic. Thank you. And you avoided that buzzword passion in your presentation. Good job.
I did, but it looks like I got some of the other buzzwords like evergreen or authenticity.
Well, passion is not a bad buzzword, but it is certainly one that I think every person who's gotten into podcasting and listens to people talk about podcasting hears someone say, you have to have passion. You have to follow your passion. So that you made something that was all about the 6 P's of podcasting, that it didn't include that word passion, although it certainly included the concept. Great job. And thank you for your generosity in that artwork. Check is really cool. And,
it is very beta. It's the developer's still working on it at the moment, but we just know how frustrating it was for our mastermind members who wanted to see what their artwork looks like. And this is why we just keep building things that comes from a need of the community. And I don't think one exists at the moment. And if it does, it doesn't really matter. But it's pretty fun to be able to put your artwork there and go, oh, that's what it looks like on a phone. And that's what I can't read that link down the bottom. So
back when I used to design podcast cover art for clients, which I don't do anymore, but I would have to do that manually. I'd have all of these Photoshop templates, and I'd have to put the cover art image into the Photoshop templates every time. And so this tool is really cool. Yeah. Cool. So thank you very much for sharing, Ray, from Australia. I know it's late down there, but we really appreciate your being part of International Podcast Day. So thank you, and I'll let you go.
No worries. Thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure. Rock on, everyone.
And tell us one more time, where can people check out your show or what you offer?
Yeah. Cool. So RazorSharpShow.com is the podcast, and podcastlaunch.co is all about launching your podcast.
Fantastic. Ray from Australia, thank you very much.
No worries. Until next time, stay sharp.
Our coverage and this live stream of International Podcast Day continues. Coming up will be Cormac Moore talking about what they're doing in podcasting. It will be what radio can teach podcasters. You may think radio is the competition. No, you can learn from that. So that's coming up soon. Stay here at internationalpodcastday.com/live for each session and for the chat room. Remember to tweet out with that hashtag International Podcast Day. Let's get this trending. Let's celebrate the power of podcasts. So for Cormac Moore and the International Podcast Day team, I'm Daniel J. Lewis. We'll be back for our next session in just a few minutes.